Recording.
Hi guys, and welcome back to the Barbell Lifestyle Podcast. I'm your host, Christina Lynn, and I'm here with my co-hosts, Marissa Roy and Sadie Bug. So if you watch on the YouTube channel, you'll see that my dog, Sadie, is in my lap. So she's here for today's episode, but today is a really exciting episode. Marissa and I were just talking before we started hitting record about how this is just going to be a really good discussion speaking to population who maybe is beginning tracking macros or maybe isn't really sure what to do and is just starting out in their health and fitness journey. So today we're going to do a macros 101. So talking all about what macros are, maybe how to track macros, a lot of principles that go into tracking your food. And we're just really, really excited to get this one going.
Yeah. And I think that this is really something that we tend to assume people know about or assume people know how to do when we're talking in our posts or in our podcast episodes. And, we're talking about, okay, well, with your macros, let's do this, or adherence to your macros, this is how you can get better at that. So lots of ways that we kind of just skip over, like, okay, what if there is a person who doesn't actually understand how to track their macros? And so we're just going to break everything down to the most basic level so that you can have a stronger understanding of how to actually get started with tracking your food, because it is our preferred method of, I think, dieting for ourselves and for our clients. And we find it to be the most comprehensive and the most flexible. So we're just kind of taking a step back today and breaking down all of the basics so that you can always reference this episode back if you need a refresher, or if you are trying to share this with someone who maybe needs to catch up and figure that out for themselves.
Yeah, so I think maybe to talk, we'll talk about what macros are, but I think when you brought up why that macros is our preferred method of like coaching and what works for us. So maybe talking a little bit about that before we go into what macros are. So there are a lot of different style diets that you can do. There's low carb, ketogenic, low fat. You can implement Weight Watchers, paleo. There are just so many different types of diets out there. And so Marissa and I track macros, or we implement flexible dieting. And so we have found that that is the most realistic and most sustainable method of dieting. And so that's why we choose it, because we feel like while it sometimes can feel restrictive at times, it does give you the most flexibility with your food choices, and it's not super, super strict and rigid. So like, for example, ketogenic, you have to eat very low carb, very high fat. And that's difficult to sustain over a long period of time. So that is one of the reasons that we implement tracking macros and flexible dieting with ourselves and also with our clients.
Yeah. And I think one thing to kind of preface is when we say method of dieting, a diet is just the way that someone eats. If you don't pay any attention to what you put in your body and you just grab what's convenient and maybe you go through the drive-through, that's still your diet. So when we say method of dieting, we're not just talking about fat loss. Spoiler alert, we will do an episode specifically on fat loss, but that is not today. When we say method of dieting, we're talking about the way that you choose to eat or the way that you monitor your eating, because to an extent, everyone has to monitor the way they eat. They may or may not put a lot of thought into it. They may or may not put a lot of care into it, but eating is something that we have to do every single day. It's something we have to make decisions about every single day. So essentially just prefacing with that. And then the next thing that I wanted to add on to that is, we look at flexible dieting. So flexible dieting and tracking macros, we're going to use pretty interchangeably throughout this episode. But I like to think of it as it implements a sustainable structure, and we can essentially become more or less sustainable within that. So this is something I talk about a lot with my clients. In a period of time where we're focusing on fat loss, for example, fat loss in and of itself is not sustainable because we're trying to do something temporary to reach a goal. But the structure itself of knowing what's in your food, knowing how to portion it and basically being able to manipulate that at any given time, that is sustainable. That is empowerment. That is knowledge that you can use at any given time. So there's always going to be periods of unsustainability within a sustainable structure. And we find that flexible dieting gives us that structure that we can choose to, be more or less rigid at any given time, depending on our goal. But things like the ketogenic diet, for example, or things like a intermittent fasting window that's very strict, those sorts of things immediately eliminate flexibility from our lives. So if we are eliminating all carbohydrates, all starchy carbohydrates with a ketogenic diet, that's something that we are theoretically supposed to do forever. And that is very unrealistic in most contexts, social contexts, cultural contexts. So it's really hard to make that a sustainable framework. So when we talk about flexible dieting, one of the main principles of tracking your macros is that you can theoretically have anything in a certain amount within the context of your day, within the context of a healthy diet. You can have any type of food, any carb, any fat, any junk food. You can theoretically fit all of these things in. And so this is where the idea of if it fits your macros comes in. But yeah, I guess we can just kind of break down the concepts of flexible dieting to start.
Yeah, so flexible dieting, do you want to jump into flexible dieting or like what macros are?
Let's give a background of like what the macros are so people can just get a baseline, and then we can get into like how to actually utilize it and how is beneficial to use it, how is not beneficial to use it, and mindset things towards the end. Yeah, let's just break down the macros.
So I have the FDA definition of macronutrients. So they are the components of food that provide energy, so calories, and they are considered macronutrients. So again, kind of like big picture, because our bodies require these to perform essential bodily functions such as metabolism, digestion, things like that. And again, they're macronutrients because our bodies require them in large amounts to maintain like our growth, support metabolism, and just assist with other bodily functions. So there are 3 types of macronutrients that we'll focus on, which are proteins, carbs, and fats. So although alcohol and fiber play an essential role into our body, composition, and health, these are the 3 that we will focus on in today's episode.
Yeah, and I think when we are comparing, large amounts, what is a large amount compared to, how do we quantify that? So obviously like our food breaks down in our system, and this is all on like a molecular level, and we're definitely not going to get into biochemistry, but we're comparing macronutrients to micronutrients. So macronutrients are larger molecules that are broken down piece by piece when we digest. And micronutrients are even smaller, and they're, micro in that sense. And so those micronutrients are things like our water, our vitamins, our minerals. So if we are tracking macronutrients, to give you a sense of size, when we track macronutrients, we typically tend to track things in grams. And so we use food scales that tracks things in grams. 1 gram is about the weight of a paperclip, is the analogy that I often hear. And so 1 paperclip equals 1 gram. And then when we track things in for micros, these are typically tracked as milligrams. And so that's 1,000th of a gram. So if you can think of 1,000th of a paperclip, that is how micronutrients are quantified, which is why that we obviously cannot just pick up and weigh with our hands, right? And so we don't really worry about those micronutrients quite so much. We kind of get those into our diet indirectly just by making sure our food sources are varied and we're having lots of fruits and vegetables, maybe taking a multivitamin that does have the adequate amounts. But when we talk about tracking our macronutrients, we can actually weigh out our food in grams, and we can discover what these portions actually look like to give you like a size perspective.
Yeah, and I'm not sure which episode this will come out in like what order it will, but we did interview Eric Helms, and we talked next one. Okay, so this will be a really good episode to listen to before you listen to that one. Well, you're going to have to wait. But we broke down the muscle and strength nutrition pyramid. And so we talk about macronutrients being kind of at the bottom of the pyramid. So being what you should focus on first before you start worrying about micronutrients. Because again, macros are just kind of like a bigger picture. So really focusing on what you can eat to hit your macros, and then starting to focus on and think about micronutrients and the quality of food and the food choices that you're making. So this will be a good episode. And then listening to that will just really help kind of pull and pull this all together. So that's, again, why we focus on macros first.
Yes, I love that. And I think before I go on a tangent, just talking about that, let's just get back into macros, because I think that episode will do it better justice.
Yeah, definitely. So I guess we can jump in and talk about protein first. So, I guess protein, carbs, and fat. So the calorie component. So per gram, protein is 4 calories per gram. Same thing with carbohydrates, 4 calories per gram, and fats are 9 calories per gram. So again, if we were thinking about that paperclip analogy, 1 paperclip of protein and carbs is 4 calories, and 1 paperclip of fat is 9.
Yes. And so essentially, I guess the next step with that, let's talk about each macro and what they do for our bodies. And then I guess we can get into how you can actually start tracking these, right?
Yeah. So protein, there are a lot of different purposes that it serves. But basically it's, preserving lean muscle mass, the growth and maintenance and repair of muscle tissues in their cell. They promote healthy immune function, help with satiety, which is helps manage your hunger. They also can serve as another source of energy, even though carbs are normally what is taken first. They assist with making essential hormones and enzymes, can help promote healthy hair, skin, and nails, help maintain fluid balance on a cellular level, and it can transmit information between cells and nutrients like tissues and organs throughout your body. And they also help regulate your body's pH balance.
Yes. So to kind of summarize, I think, and just big picture, what is the benefit of eating protein? And we're going to get into how to actually set your protein goal to eat enough protein. But main thing here, our focus, I think, that we really like to harp on when we're talking about changing body composition, getting stronger, getting fitter, protein gains or helps you gain or preserve muscle. So it's going to stimulate what's called muscle protein synthesis, which is just a fancy term for the process of building or repairing muscle after you've broken it down. So you've probably heard before that when you work out, you make little micro tears in your muscle fibers. That muscle protein synthesis is what brings that back together, is what repairs your muscle. So if you're dieting for fat loss, it's going to prevent you from losing muscle mass. And if you are at maintenance or in a surplus, having enough protein is going to help you gain lean body mass if your training stimulus is present. Protein, like Christina said, is a secondary energy source. So what that means is, while we would love to just eat a 100% protein only diet, just go 100% carnivore or something like that, our bodies don't prefer to use protein as a fuel source. Protein has to go through a number of extra steps in cell processes to actually be converted into glucose. So it's important to note here that when we are using protein as a fuel source, it's actually just being regenerated into a carb so that it can be used. And so the carb is our body's preferred fuel source. And we'll see that, how that kind of plays into energy systems. But yeah, so protein, we don't really want to be using it as an energy source. And typically when we are using it as a primary energy source, it indicates that we're not getting enough total calories overall, because our body will kind of resort to breaking down muscle tissue to give us more energy by breaking down protein. We don't really want that. It's energy expensive to do so. And obviously it eats away at our muscle. So we don't want to be using protein as an energy source. So we don't want to just fill all of our calories with protein. That's why we need carbs and fats to give us that more ready source of energy. But protein has a number of other functions, like she just outlined for us. And I think the last thing is protein, like you said, is the most satiating macronutrient. So to put them in order, protein is the number one most satiating macronutrient. The reason why is because it actually takes more energy and time to break down protein in the digestion process. So it has what's called the highest thermic effect of food. So roughly 40% or so, 30 to 40% of the calories in the protein that you eat is actually burned off by the process of digesting it because it takes that much to break it down. So that's not to say that, you know, we can just negate those calories and not count them, but it's important to know that like it's going to take a while to burn through your protein, digest your protein that you eat. And so if you have a higher protein diet, you're most likely going to have less issues with feeling really, really hungry, and you're going to feel more satiated throughout the day, I think. And then fat will come next and carbs as the least.
Yeah. So I oftentimes, Sadie just smacked my earbuds out. But one of the things that I've found from clients is they will talk about how they are super hungry throughout the day. And I take a look at their macros and they're eating a ton of carbs, but they don't have a lot of protein in their diet. So that's one of the number one things that really changing up and thinking about what you're actually eating throughout the day can make a really, really big difference in your hunger and how you feel and how you go about your day. But like Marissa was saying, just kind of to summarize protein, like in order to build, maintain, and repair muscle, our bodies need an adequate amount of protein. So, you know, a diet deficient in protein can lead to muscle atrophy, so the wasting away of muscles, and protein is also really helpful in creating a positive change in body composition. And so I don't think we need to go into it, but a protein deficiency can also lead to like health issues. But in what we're focusing on into kind of today's episode is that it's really essential if we are looking to build muscle. So one of the things I think to highlight is what kind of food items you can eat and start implementing into your diet to get more protein. So lots of types of lean meats and fish like chicken, turkey, beef, pork, ham, tuna, maybe some like deli meat, eggs, egg whites, some dairy products like yogurt, milk, cheese, cottage cheese, Marissa's favorite.
Okay, so interjection, funny story here. When we went to go visit Christina and her husband for a week, so she was like asking me beforehand, like, what do you think you would need like grocery wise that you'd want to have here, just like to make sure that you can hit your macros or you know, just kind of like have your staples around.
I'm such a considerate friend, by the way.
Yes, you definitely are. I really appreciate that. So I was like, okay, I could probably just use some protein sources because that's probably the easiest to fall short on, and we'll definitely get into that this episode. But yeah, so I was like, Greek yogurt, just make sure that there's like some animal-based protein sources around, and cottage cheese, like zero fat cottage cheese is like my favorite. And she was like, ew.
Ew.
So my favorite thing to do is doing like cottage cheese, cinnamon, and some berries as like, I don't know where I got the idea, but like I personally like the texture of cottage cheese. I go in phases where like I can eat it all the time, and then like there's like a couple months where I'm like, this is kind of disgusting, and then I go back to craving it. So it's like a really weird like on and off cycle. So I get why people don't like it, but I was definitely in a phase of really liking it when I went to go visit.
And the last day that we were here, we were kind of like cleaning out the fridge, and I can't remember if my husband said something or if I did, but I was
He
like,
did.
he's like, get this shit out of here.
He was literally like, Marissa, you need to eat that. Get that shit out of our fridge.
Yeah. So cottage cheese is a good source of protein.
It is.
You could also eat tofu. And then there are also our supplements that you can implement, like whey, casein, soy, isolate, like protein bars and protein snacks. But the other thing to think about is that there are kind of, we want to focus on complete sources of protein. And while some things like some other things you can get like trace sources of protein. But the other thing too is that something like eggs versus egg whites. So eggs have higher fat content. So you do need to be careful of things like that. Like salmon is also going to be like a higher fat protein source compared to like cod or tilapia. So there are some overlapping items that you can eat that will both kind of qualify as a fat and also protein. Same thing with carbs, that it can also be fat and can also be protein. But those are just some general food items that you can work in that will help you hit your protein goal.
Yeah, and I think when we're providing a list of like protein sources that we could be eating, I think it's important to make that distinction, like lean protein sources, so like a chicken breast versus a fattier protein source like a chicken thigh. There's also carbier protein sources, so like beans, black beans. Um, I'm blanking, but like a ton of other beans, like pretty much every legume is going to have a pretty high amount of protein. It's a good protein source for vegan diets, vegetarian diets, but they're also high in carbs. So those two overlap for sure. And so just making sure that when you are grocery shopping, taking a look at, is this, a more pure source of protein? Does it have carbs? Does it have fats? So when you are tracking your macros, when you are aiming to hit a certain macro target, that you know how to balance those things out to actually hit your target and not just go over on certain ones. But I kind of like the structure that we've put together here. So we're going over each macronutrient. What does it do? Some food examples. Now, let's just be comprehensive and say, how much protein do we actually need, and kind of tie that all together. And then we'll move on to fats and carbs. So how much protein? The FDA, or the RDA, I'm sorry, recommended daily allowance of protein is 0.8 grams per kilogram per day. That is not a lot of protein. So if you take your body weight, my body weight in kilograms is just my body weight divided by 2.204. And that is, because I can't do mental math.
Mathing.
I weigh, yeah, and I'm Asian. Like what a shame. But but I weigh about 150 pounds. So in kilograms, that is 68 kilos. So if I multiply 68 by 0.8, that is 54 grams of protein per day. So it's very easy to not be below the RDA for protein recommendations. And the important distinction here is that the RDA is the recommended amount of protein to prevent disease in the general population. So this is not talking about clinical populations. This is not talking about special populations. This is just generally in the United States. To prevent disease, you would need that much amount of protein per day. So the requirement for resistance training, for athletes, for individuals trying to change their body composition goes up pretty drastically. So some of the recommendations from the NSCA, the body that I'm certified by, for certain types of athletes like endurance athletes or team sport athletes, they want the athletes to be getting anywhere from 1.0 to 1.6 grams per kilogram per day. So that's at least, if I were that type of athlete, 68 grams of protein to about 1.5 times. So over 100 grams of protein for sure. So 68 times 1.6 is 108.8. So yeah, definitely can't mental math. I'm sorry to be a shame to my culture, but 108.8, so about 110 grams of protein on the higher end. Then when we get into protein recommendations for body composition change, that's going to be even higher, because when we want to build muscle, we need to give our bodies enough resources of protein to actually be able to repair and create new tissues, because that's what building muscle is. We're creating new tissue. So we need to have enough fuel to do so. So with that, we want to get roughly between 0.8, and now I'm going to convert to the US conversion system here, 0.8 to 1.0 grams per pound of body weight which in kilograms, if you're listening internationally, that's roughly 1.8 to 2.2 grams per kilo per day. So that is going to be pretty much keeping your protein intake close to body weight. For most people, that 0.8 grams per pound or 1.8 grams per kilo is a lot easier to hit on the first time you're ever tracking your macros, because getting more protein is hard. It can be hard at first. But as you get more advanced and as you get more used to that sort of intake and that sort of dietary habit, if these are your goals, and listening to this podcast, I would sure hope so. But then you might want to err towards 1 gram per pound or 2.2 grams per kilo. And you can even go above that. You can go actually much farther above that. There's research to prove that up to 3 or 4 grams per kilogram, so close to 1.5 to 2 times your body weight of grams of protein per day, is proven safe in healthy individuals that are active. So caveat there is the population, healthy individuals that are active, but that is shown to be safe as well. How much more beneficial, we don't quite know yet, but there have been some anecdotes to show that keeping your protein slightly higher can be more beneficial for body comp change.
Yes, and I think for anyone who is a bodybuilder, I think I can't remember what study it was, but I think that they were mentioning that having a higher intake of protein in your off season can do a lot for your health, a more healthier body composition. So I did see that, but I think just for general pop, if you're just starting out, that 1 pound of body weight, I think is a really good, very easy rule of thumb. So if you weigh 130 pounds, you should be getting roughly 130 grams of protein per day. And give or take, and again, like Marissa was saying, once you have a very good grasp and you can hit your macros, start playing around with your percentages, and maybe you go to 120, maybe you go to 140, and see how your digestion is, see how you feel, see if there are any changes in your body composition. And of course, these take a little bit of time for you to figure out, but you can still play around and try to get an idea of what works best for you, because again, what works for someone else may not be what you need to reach your goals. So another kind of consumption suggestion is, again, to maximize building muscle and maintenance and repair. It's a good idea, and it's suggested to really spread out your protein consumption evenly throughout the day. So really, again, focusing mostly on females, because that's our population. I guess at least for the audience for this podcast, is focusing around 20 to 40 grams of protein per meal. So if you, again, we're going back to if you were Marissa and you're consuming 150 grams of protein per day, and let's say she's having 5 meals, she should be having roughly 30 grams of protein per meal. So thinking about maybe 30 grams for breakfast, maybe you have like a protein shake for a snack. For lunch, again, 30 grams, maybe you have another snack, and then you have dinner. So those would be the 5 times and the 5 meals for 30 grams. So that's just an easy way to take that, to take however much you're eating per day, divide it by however many meals or snacks you like to eat, and that will be your guideline.
Yeah, and the only reason why 20 to 40 grams is the recommended for women is it's kind of based on body size. So like relative, right? Like if I'm a pretty like healthy weight woman for my height, 150 grams, that falls right in the middle of 20 to 40, so 30 grams per meal. If you're a guy who weighs 250 pounds, that's going to be higher per meal because your protein intake is going to be higher. But yeah, general rule of thumb, take your protein intake, divide by the number of meals per day that you like to eat. It doesn't have to be 5. It can be 3. It can be 4. It can be 6. We don't care. Divide it up and try to get that in consistently. So that's protein. That's all I have to say on protein. So let's move on to carbs. What do carbs do? So like we said, carbs are our preferred energy source. So carbs can be complex, they can be simple, and they will break down into glucose regardless of what kind of carb they are. So a complex carb is something like oatmeal or sweet potatoes, or something that's going to, the premise of that is it has a lower GI rating, so how quickly it actually breaks down in your system and stimulates insulin. And it's going to just take longer to digest because the complex carbohydrates are larger molecules, so it takes longer to break them apart. Simpler carbs like sugar, candy, cereal, even things that are like maybe you wouldn't consider as unhealthy, but like rice or white rice or rice cakes, those are simpler carbs, and they're going to essentially just be smaller carb molecules that break into glucose easier and quicker. And so they might have a higher GI index, so they might spike insulin a little bit more. But it's important to realize here that both complex and simple carbohydrates end up as glucose either way. I think that's something that not a lot of people truly understand. So we have our carbs. What do? They give us energy. They give us energy for our training. They give us energy in our brain. Our brain's primary fuel source is glucose. So oftentimes when we go on a low carb diet and we have brain fog, that is why that happens, because our brains love to function off of glucose. And the amount that our brains can use fat converted to glucose for fuel is less so than our bodies. So that makes it even more difficult for us for a while until we really adapt if we're doing low carb. But I'm not going to get into too much of a rant with low carb diets.
No, but if you go back to the first few episodes, I have what you would consider prep brain because I was not having a lot of carbs. And so it's your brain just doesn't function at the right speed.
I remember like before the first episode that we recorded, Christina was like, Marissa, like if I skip words, I'm sorry. Like if I just like randomly skip words and sentences, and I was like, is this a good time to be starting a podcast?
When I can't speak. It makes me think, I don't think that you're not a big Office fan, but for anyone of all of my Office fans, it just makes me think of Kevin Malone when he starts like leaving out words and he he just skips words and like really simplifies all of his sentences, but that's how I feel. But yeah, so carbs help your brain function properly. So they are, again, carbs are considered a macronutrient because they are essential. So there are a lot of still, even in 2021, there are still women out there who believe that carbs are they need to eat super low carb all the time and that carbs will make them fat. And there's just a big misconception around them, but they are considered a macronutrient because they are essential and they help us function.
So I do want to clarify though, they're not technically essential because our bodies can convert other fuel sources into glucose.
Right.
But our bodies use glucose regardless of if we're eating glucose. That's the important thing. And so like the argument with the ketogenic diet is carbs are not essential, so we can just cut them all out and we can use ketones as fuel. So that is the one exception, is if you do like completely convert over to ketosis, which is very, very hard to do. It's not just starting to go on keto for 7 days. Takes months. But if you are 100% keto, you can use ketones as fuel, but in every other circumstance, and if you break out of ketosis, you're going to use glucose as fuel. So it's not essential, but like, you know, you use a lot of glucose.
It's not essential, but it is.
It's like you're gonna probably you'll benefit from having adequate glucose. So training, it's fuel. Brains, it's our fuel, and our body uses it very easily. Glucose goes through the bloodstream, goes to our muscles, goes to our cells, and our body loves to use it. So
yes, so they're also necessary for like your central nervous system, your kidney. Again, we talked about your brains and your muscle to function properly, and promotes healthy intestinal system and healthy digestion.
Fiber.
Yes. So again, so having carbs, again, make your body's main source of energy, but it can help like combat fatigue, headaches, digestive issues, weakness, difficulty concentrating. So most people if you were to just eat and not really consider what you're eating, a lot of people, their diets will consist primarily of carbs.
Yes. So that is, and without getting too much into fiber, but I think one thing that some of my clients and people that I talk to don't necessarily know is they're like, hey, what's a good source of fiber? You know, carbs, provide fiber. Carbs are the only thing that provide fiber. So if you're looking at a more complex carbohydrate, that might have more fiber because it's harder to break down. There's two types of fiber. I'm not going to get quite into it, but leafy greens, vegetables, and whole grains and legumes are going to be your main sources of fiber. And that is a type of a subcategory of carbohydrate that is on the complex side of things because it's very hard to break down. And that's why it helps with digestion. And I'm going to leave it at that. But do you want to just kind of briefly go through some carb food sources?
Yeah, definitely. So there are food items that you can eat like oatmeal, rice, potatoes, bread, cereal, wraps like tortillas, beans, lentils, quinoa, and then of course fruits and vegetables, cereal, lots of carbs.
Yeah. So carbs are fun. And I think talking about, we talked about protein sources have overlap with fats and carbs. Carbs are going to have overlap with protein sources. So if you look at the macronutrient profiles for vegetables, for example, a lot of vegetables have a couple of grams of protein here and there. So you'll get a little bit added up from your vegetables. Not a ton though. It's really just like trace sources like we've mentioned before. And then there's going to be carb and fat combinations. So those are the fun ones. Those are baked goods. Those are donuts, cookies, ice cream. So when the thing is when we hear people say like, I'm going to cut out carbs or sugar, and they're like, well, I'm cutting out, cookies and baked goods and all of those yummy things. They're not just cutting out carbs and sugar. They're cutting out carbs and fats and tons of calories by doing so. And so it's important to know exactly what you're talking about when you're making those exclusions from your diet, which is why the principles of flexible dieting and understanding all of this is so, so important.
Yeah. So in terms of the general dietary recommendation, I set protein first, and then I set fat, and then whatever is remaining, I set for carbs. So we can talk about that a little bit, but carbs are kind of like the last thing and just kind of whatever is remaining of your calories. So I guess we can talk about fat first and then jump into calorie or to carbs again. But that is generally how I set my macros for my clients.
That's exactly how I do it too. So I was going to say, like, when we actually get into how to set your own macros, we could just walk through that. So yeah, we could just bump on over to fat.
Well, so I wanted to talk about just general consumption suggestions. So again, focusing on meal timing and how to structure your meals. Again, we'll talk about the strength and nutrition pyramid, but it is your calories, your macronutrients, your micronutrients, and then we start thinking about meal timing. So if you're still starting out, it's okay to not worry about when you should eat carbs, when you should eat fats, how to space out your protein. You're just focusing on hitting your numbers. But again, if you are a little bit more advanced or if you've got it down, it's suggested to have a majority of your carbs pre and post workout. Again, so that is something that I tell my clients, and that is something that I generally follow, but this is to help before training sessions, which will be you're better able to utilize those carbs as energy. So you can have a more beneficial session than if you just went in and you had maybe just a super high fat meal or nothing at all. But these kind of, and then again, we'll talk about reverse dieting. We've talked about that before, but fat loss, but carbs are generally something that you will see a lot of fluctuation, either an increase or decrease in whether you are cutting, whether you are maintaining, or you're going through a building phase. And then I guess we should have preference or just said that protein generally stays fairly consistent regardless of whatever phase that you're in. So if you're in a fat loss phase, or if you are bulking or building, your protein will generally stay the same throughout the entirety of that process, and really won't change a whole lot throughout your lifetime.
Unless your body weight like drastically changes.
Right. But should generally stay pretty consistent. But carbs and fats are what are the macronutrients that we change quite a bit.
Yeah, definitely. So we'll manipulate those. And like a general rule of thumb, if we're just going to go with like plate planning with carbohydrates, you want to have about the size of your palm at each meal that you sit down for. And we'll get into why that kind of coincides with the recommendations that we would give anyways. But yeah, that was a good add-on.
Yeah, so that brings us into fats. So fats are essential for growth, development, energy, being able to absorb vitamins. They provide cushion for our organs. They can help regulate our body temperature, maintain like your cell members, and regulating hormones, I think is a really, really big and important one. And again, serves as another source of energy. So Marissa had mentioned with a keto diet, when you go into ketosis, you do utilize fats as your energy source. But again, fats are very, very essential and are very important, especially for females.
Yes, dietary fat is more and more important the more that we learn about it. It's so crucial for hormones. One of the things that I've actually been doing some reading on with my male clients lately is I've been trying to keep their fat intakes a little bit higher because, especially when they're going into a fat loss phase, because testosterone has a cholesterol backbone. So that is a fatty backbone. Hormones function via fats. So if you are trying to keep testosterone high, which helps keep your muscle mass and keeps your strength, and this goes for men and women, but especially for men, that higher fat diet can be super beneficial. For women, a higher fat diet, and we're not talking like, going keto, but like just keeping fat in a good, healthy range and not restricting it, is really good for hormonal balance, and a lot of times can help with just our menstrual cycles and the symptoms that we feel with that, and just overall being more even keeled across the month. I think because when our hormones are really dysregulated, we kind of notice with the way that our behavior changes and our mood.
Yes. Shameless plug for Poise.
Yes, Core Poise is just a hormone and thyroid balancing supplement that has come out recently by Core.
Yeah. So I will actually, well, I guess we're going to get off on a tiny, tiny little side tangent, but I personally am severely affected by my period and my cycle every month, and I have really bad symptoms. So I just ordered Core Poise, and it should be here pretty soon. So I will definitely report back on how I feel like that's kind of helped and whether it's alleviated any symptoms for me. But you want to jump in?
Yeah. We actually have a couple of interviews coming up where we'll be touching on these topics, specifically menstrual cycles and thyroid function. So we can definitely give you guys some updates in the coming weeks on that.
Yeah, but another thing I was going to mention is I do really focus on fat, especially for women and especially those who are trying to get pregnant. We want to make sure that our hormones are in a really, really good spot for that. So I do concentrate a lot on fat for my women who are going through that phase.
So how much I think is a good thing. So like when we are setting our fat, I tend to say, let's not get below 20% of total calories. I typically like to set fat around 25 to 30% of total calories for most people. And in general, like when I'm starting with a new client and I see what their macronutrient intake is like, it's usually especially with women, they already are kind of trying to restrict their carbs. So typically I see pretty high fat intakes. So if I'm trying to adapt to a client, I'm not going to completely shift their whole, paradigm of nutrition upside down so that they can't eat anything that's sitting in their fridge, right? So I'm probably going to set fat intake a little bit higher to start just to make it easier to transition in. So I might even be at 35% of total calories for someone who maybe is coming in, who feels like they need to restrict their carbs. They're eating moderate to low carbs and pretty high fat. So typically with that, I'll bring their carbs up a little bit so that they feel the effects of that. And eventually we'll get to something that I see as more ideal. But that first step, especially, we'll get into how to set your macros. But that's pretty much like 25 to 35% is where I typically tend to fall with most people.
Yeah. So I do that 15 to 35% of the daily calories. But again, if we're going off of per pound of body weight, a good rule of thumb is like 0.35 to 0.45 grams per pound of body weight. So if you're setting your own, that's a good rule of thumb. But again, if you are looking to implement fat into your diet, there are things that you can eat like avocado, nuts, oils, fatty meat, like we talked about before, salmon, maybe cuts of steak, cheese, flax seeds, egg yolks, nut butters, things like that. Do you have any more that you can think of?
That pretty much about covers it. Most fat sources tend to overlap, with fat or protein or fat and carbs. So yeah, that's a pretty good overview. Pretty much not much except for like nuts, and not even nuts. Like they have some protein, but like oils are like the only like pure fat, like oils and butter. So yeah, that pretty much about covers it.
Yeah, butter. I can't believe I left that out. My husband eats so much. But yeah, so dietary fat is essential for a lot of bodily functions. But what I found in terms of body composition is that it's not advantageous for body composition to have a very high fat diet and to also have a very high carb diet. So I always think that there needs to be a little bit of a balance. And I typically have people eat a higher consumption of carbs. And while fat does change, the range isn't quite as big as it will be for carbs. And that is my coaching philosophy and how I do things.
Yeah, definitely. I'm right there with you. So I think that pretty much covers all the macronutrients, if you would agree. So we can kind of get into how do we get started with actually tracking your macros, setting up your macros. So I'm just going to walk you guys through like how we have like our clients start with us, because that's essentially how we get them to start tracking macros, if that's the approach that we've agreed upon. And it's not everyone, but that's what this episode is about. So typically when I have a client getting started, I have them do what's called a data collection week. And basically this is exactly what it sounds like. They're collecting data on themselves so that we can get a good sense of what their baseline is. And what their weight is doing on that baseline. So it's important to acknowledge, and we've talked about this in our interview with Dr. Grant Tinsley, is when you have people collect data on themselves with their diet, they tend to alter things a little bit because maybe they weren't aware of their nutrition before and now they are. So now they're more careful, or they don't want to log something because they're ashamed of it. So it's important to be aware that a certain amount of like cognizance and restriction comes into someone's life when they start to monitor what they're eating. But it still gives us a decent baseline because we can make that assumption that like maybe things totaled up to a little bit higher beforehand. But we get to see what happens with their weight. So what I have them do is I have them plug everything into a tracking app. My preferred one for clients is MyFitnessPal because it has the most diverse base of food sources, like culturally and just overall, like has the most comprehensive database that I've been able to see so far. So just track everything that you eat, drink, put into your body that has calories for a week straight, and then report that as well as your daily weigh-ins for that week. And so with that, we can see a trend of like, did their weight go down because maybe they started becoming more aware, started restricting, or did their weight stay the same, or did their weight go up? And it's very important for this week. So this is how we would suggest you get started with tracking macros as well, is do this for 1 or 2 weeks even, and be very, very honest with yourself. Even if you go out and have Popeyes, for example, or if you go out and go through the drive-through and you're just having a horrible day and you overeat and you feel sick, like try your best to like get an estimate of all of that, as crappy as it might sound to look at like in total numbers, but actually seeing those baselines is very, very important. So what we do with that information is we'll take the average of the carb intake, we'll take the average of the fat intake, we'll take the average of the protein intake over that 1 or 2 week period. And then we take a look at the trend in your weight. Did it go down? Did it go up? Did it stay the same? And from that information, we can get a pretty general sense of whether or not that total calorie intake, again, like we said at the beginning, carbs are 4 calories per gram, protein is 4 calories per gram, and fat is 9. We do that multiplication, we do that addition, we add it up to your total average calories per day for that time frame. That gives us a good sense of, are you in a deficit? Are you at maintenance? Are you in a surplus? And then we can go from there with how to actually manipulate calories.
Yeah. So, like Marissa was saying, I do the exact same thing with my clients. I have them do some data collection. And generally speaking, like the more accurate you can be with your food, the more accurate we can be with your starting numbers. So, that's really important. And one of the things that we tell our clients is like, whatever you eat, whatever you drink, whatever your normal habits are, keep those the same, no judgment. We just want to know what you're doing. And that also gives us a really good insight into how we can maybe change some of your habits and some of the things that you're eating. But that's a really, really good thing. So again, if you're doing this on your own, being very true to yourself and what you're currently doing will help you be the most accurate and really start your numbers off strong.
Yeah. So I think, with data collection, this might be your first time thinking about how you're going to track your food, how you're going to get into this. Some rules for how to actually track your food. Number one, get a food scale that weighs in grams and ounces so that you can weigh your food accurately when you're at home. When you go out to eat, we're not asking you to go take your food scale out to a restaurant. You can, but make estimates based on what you're learning and the portion sizes that you're learning to now visualize. But in general, if you're eating mostly from home or, you're able to weigh most of your food, you're going to get a good sense of, how accurate your perceptions of portion sizes are. You want to be using your food scale pretty much while you are tracking macros. When you are working towards a specific goal, that is very, very important to retain accuracy. Another thing is how to actually.
I wanted to say, sorry, real quickly. So one of the reasons, so a lot of serving sizes you'll see on the biggest example I have right now is peanut butter. So if you were to turn your peanut butter jar around and look at the label, it'll say maybe serving size 1 tablespoon, 2 tablespoons. It'll be like anywhere between like 14 to 28 grams, depending on the serving size. But one of the reasons that we recommend using a food scale versus a measuring spoon, like a tablespoon, is maybe my tablespoon will be different than Marissa's in the sense that we scoop it out and we look at the peanut butter and we go, yeah, this is about a tablespoon. So you can kind of eyeball things and that's going to be way more accurate than you just taking a spoon and like an actual spoon and like dipping things out. But having that food scale, you're going to be accurate to the gram. So if the serving size is 1 tablespoon, but it's 14 grams, and you take your spoon and you measure out 14 grams, you're going to be exact. You're going to know exactly how many calories are in that tablespoon versus just kind of estimating or eyeballing. But measuring cups, measuring spoons is still going to be more accurate than doing like just kind of guessing.
Yeah. And either way, you're going to be disappointed when you realize how small an actual tablespoon of peanut butter is or how much that actually weighs. The second thing I was going to say is how to actually plug things in. So it's very easy on MyFitnessPal when you have something with a barcode to scan, weigh, plug in. That's pretty self-explanatory. But when it comes to things that don't really have a label, so let's talk produce, let's talk animal protein sources, let's talk, vegetables, fruit, chicken, beef. How do you track that? So the key search term there is going to be, you want to search, let's say ground beef. You buy 90% ground beef, you would search 90/10 or 90% lean ground beef, USDA. So the reason why we're typing in USDA here is to basically just specify we're looking for the USDA database entry for this food. And that's going to give you the most accurate because it's coming straight from the USDA. They've done the calorimetry. It's like how they measure calories in foods. They've done it and they know exactly how much is in that. And it's usually going to be, you'll probably see like per 100 grams or per 28 or 113 grams. So 113 grams is 4 ounces. It's kind of like the standard for a lot of things for protein sources. 28 grams is equal to 1 ounce. So that's why that might be there. But typically it's per something grams, sometimes 100, sometimes those. And so that's really, really important with searching for any kind of produce, anything that is a single ingredient food that doesn't have a label, making sure to search with the key term USDA.
Another thing to point out is when you do macro track, you will have a huge amount of useless knowledge with serving sizes and labels on the back of like peanut butter. You know that it's going to be, it's going to be 14 grams. Like you just have such a random amount of knowledge of food labels in your head at all times. But well, I guess we'll kind of talk about how that plays into being able to taper off from tracking. But I just want to point that out where you're like, oh, 28 grams is 1 ounce and 113 is 4 ounces. That's just the type of knowledge that you're going to get in your head and you're going to learn throughout your time, because it can be very overwhelming in the beginning.
Yeah.
And that's how it was for us when we first started. We made a lot of mistakes with tracking. There are a lot of times where at the end of maybe a week, I'll be like, oh my gosh, like I can't believe I was tracking this incorrectly the whole time. So you're going to make mistakes. You're also going to figure out things that work best for you. Like if you're the type of person who likes to track the night before, maybe the morning of, but you're going to figure out something that works best for you. So just because your friend does it another way doesn't mean that you have to do it the same way. And that kind of goes into what Marissa was talking about when in terms of tracking meat. Well, then we get a lot of questions of, well, should I weigh it cooked versus raw? And in my personal opinion, I think that cooking raw gives you the most accuracy, but it's also not at least in terms of meat, it's not always the easiest way to do it. It's a lot easier to, cook in bulk. Like you just cook a bunch of chicken for the week, you cook a bunch of ground beef, and then you measure it out in its cooked form, because the measurements will change. But it's just what I found is just, it makes things a lot easier. And again, we always talk about sustainability. So that you're going to be able to do that, I think, for a longer time than having to try to do all the raw conversions.
Yeah, like doing math every time you portion out your chicken or your beef or your fish, like it does get annoying. So general rule of thumb with tracking raw versus cooked, you want to just remain true to the way that you actually weigh it. So there are going to be entries. So, I said 90-10, lean ground beef, USDA, raw, USDA, cooked. Add that search term in because that's going to make a difference. So typically, rule of thumb, meat tends to lose about an ounce over the cooking period because it's going to lose water when you cook it. About an ounce, but of course, if you burn the shit out of it or you like undercook it a lot, that's going to vary. So just being aware of that, not getting too caught up in the details, but just tracking cooked versus raw based on when you're actually weighing it and being consistent with that. Vegetables tend to lose weight when you cook them as well. And then things like pasta and rice gain weight when you cook them because they are absorbing water. And so it's important to know that and know what you're searching for. And usually one of the big questions with pasta is like, what does the label mean? 2 ounces is typically the cooked weight that it's talking about. Or no. I'm sorry.
So labels are in their form that they're in the box or like in the packaging. So 2 ounces is 2 ounces raw, uncooked.
Yeah, that's my bad.
Yeah, so it's the same thing with rice. So generally, and so again, a lot of people will bring this up when it comes to frozen food. Well, is it cooked? Is it when it's when it's frozen? It's in the form that it's in right now. So rice and pasta are really big ones. So we'll get into that in a little bit. But the label is how it is when it comes to you in the label.
Yeah. Even I get tripped up, but no, I just flip that in my head. But it's important to just make sure you're consistent with the way that you are weighing it and the way that you're tracking it. Because if someone, scoops out 2 ounces of cooked rice and they're like, oh my God, this is 40 carbs, like that's gonna screw your actual intake. So make sure that like what you're working with here. So search for cooked, search for raw, search for USDA. So that's how to actually track your food. So let's talk about when you have done your data collection week, you've gotten your average, you see if you're in a calorie surplus, deficit, or at maintenance. What do you do with that information now that you know you're tracking everything right, you're plugging in everything you're eating, you're staying accountable, you've gotten your data on you, and this is the average amount of calories that I ate for the past week or 2 weeks. What do I do with that? So I think it's important to analyze what your goal is. So if your goal is fat loss, and we'll go into more depth with how to actually change calories depending on your goal for fat loss specifically in another episode that we'll do. But if your goal is fat loss, you want to be in a deficit. If your goal is maintenance, you want to keep your calories in a place where your weight is not changing. And if your goal is a surplus, you want to be slowly gaining weight over time. So
I want to jump in real quickly and just say that if you have never tracked macros before, and let's say that you did your data collection week and you're looking at your macros and you're looking at your average and you're like, wow, I'm not getting nearly as enough protein as I should be, or wow, I'm severely under eating carbs or fat, and you think that you want to lose fat or you want to jump into a weight loss phase. Oftentimes, and I have found this with clients, that just switching up someone's macro percentages at their maintenance can make a huge difference in body composition. So even though you might think that your goal is fat loss or weight loss, oftentimes just simply changing up the percentages of what you eat and having you do that consistently over a period of time can be huge for your body composition.
yeah, and I was kind of gonna make that point as well, because when we set up your changes with your ratio, so what do we do with those calories? We're kind of looking at, okay, well, where are your calories now? What is your weight doing? If your calories are super low and your weight's not moving, that doesn't necessarily mean you're at maintenance. It could just mean that your ratios are kind of effed up. So a lot of times not having enough protein can cause huge stalls and plateaus in your progress. And just having inadequate nutrition overall and not prioritizing the right things can make it seem like maybe you just need to cut calories lower, but not necessarily the case. So in general, what I typically do with clients is if their calories are in a decent place, for women, I usually tend to see, and this is a huge range, but unfortunately, I see a lot of 1,200 calories. I see a lot of 1,500 calories. I don't see a lot of 17, 1,800 and above. I do see it at times. And when I do have a client who comes in and they're actually eating adequately, it makes me very happy. But typically the first thing I'll do is raise someone's calories, because we need to actually make room for having enough protein and enough dietary fat, and then not just totally going no carb with the rest of the calories. So typically I'll raise calories, a decent bit. If you're eating sub 1,500 calories, you should not be trying to decrease from there. But then you want to first set your protein, like we talked about. So that 1 gram per pound of body weight, if you really struggle with it and you're going from eating 40 grams of protein every day to now, 150, that's going to be a very, very hard change to make. So maybe starting with 110, 120, 130. It's okay to be a little bit below what your ideal goal is if you eventually work up to it. So a lot of times if I have someone who's literally eating 30 grams of protein on average per day, I'm starting them with let's try to get 100 grams per day, even if they're 200 pounds. I will say, let's try to get 100 grams per day, because that's going to make more of a difference if you can be consistent with it than trying to just go all the way up to what we might need. And so setting protein first, 0.8 to 1.0 grams per pound, or 1.8 to 2.2 grams per kilo if your goal is anything related to changing and improving body composition. The next thing, like Christina and I talked about, is we set fat second. So my rule of thumb is never below 20%, but typically 25 to 35% of total calories. And like I mentioned earlier, this for me depends a lot on what this person's diet looked like in that data collection week. So if their fat intake is super high, I know it's going to be really hard to make an adjustment for them to be adherent if they are, if they're going from eating 90 grams of fat per day to now only 20% of their total calories. So for that type of person, I might give them 30 or 35%. And that's based on the calories that we set that are most likely raised up a little bit higher, and just aimed at maintenance and aimed at basically just giving yourself enough room to have all three macronutrients in adequate amounts. And then finally, carbs, just do the multiplication. So the number of grams that you set for fats and protein, multiply by 9 and 4 respectively, and then take those remaining calories from your total. So let's say, I have 2,000 calories to work with, 1,200 of those go to fats and protein. Then I have 800 calories left to work with carbs. Divide that by 4, and you're left with 200 grams of carbs. That's like one easy math example that you can use. And basically just working with that.
Yeah, so I follow the exact same kind of formula when I'm doing either myself or my clients. So if we want to jump into how to change macros when you're not seeing the results that you want. So again, like we mentioned, I think the first thing is really focusing on what your percentages are and being consistent. So all too often I'll see clients who are like, well, my coach never changed my macros, or they haven't changed for a month. Why? And sometimes I think clients can think, well, my coach is being lazy. But oftentimes you need to be a little bit patient and really try to see if what you're doing, how it's affecting your body composition, how your weight is it stabilized? Is it changing? But let's say that you've hit a plateau and you've been at your numbers for a little while. Again, we want to see what your results are, what your result is, what you're trying to get to, and what your goals are. So if you're trying to lose weight or lose fat, then what we typically implement is a macro cut. And we are normally going to, depending on what your percentages are. So if your fat is in a very good spot, maybe you're in that 20 to 30 range and your carbs are pretty high, then maybe we'll start to reduce your carbs. And some people are very sensitive. So when you reduce carbs by just a little bit, they'll start seeing results right away. And again, we typically like to not make any adjustments until we've seen a plateau for a while. So you don't need to constantly be changing your macros all the time. So again, you might want to change up your protein and your fat, maybe if your digestion seems off. But typically you're going to be doing a lot of manipulation with carbs, and we don't recommend doing huge drastic changes. We typically do smaller, more gradual changes over time, because again, once you make a huge cut, your body eventually your metabolism is going to catch up to your intake, and you're going to plateau. And then you're going to have to make another really big cut for you to see changes. So we like to do things a little bit more gradual and do things over time.
Yeah, that consistency is huge. So I saw it was a screenshot of a tweet at some point on Instagram. And it was someone said, generally people need about an 80% level of consistency to see any kind of results. And if you take what 80% of your week is, that's 5.6 days per week. And obviously, it's either 5 or 6 days of consistency, but on average, if you are really adherent 5 to 6 days per week, and those 1 to 2 other days of the week aren't super far off, you're going to see progress. But, the only way to really be sure if something is working or not working is, are you 100% with it? If you do something for 2 or 3 weeks for 100%, meaning your macros are there, you're also hydrating, training, and taking care of sleep, stress management. There is so much shit that goes into this. But let's say you're 100% on all of that for 2 to 3 weeks and nothing happens. That's when we say, okay, it's time to make a change. And, no progress does not just mean the scale's not moving. It means your measurements aren't changing. It means your pictures don't look any different. It means you don't feel any different. A lot of times you can be making progress, but maybe it won't be reflected in one method of tracking progress. So that's really, really important when you're trying to know, do I make a change right now or not? Oftentimes the answer is you need to be more adherent and more patient.
Yeah, and one of the reasons I have my clients and myself, we typically take our weight every single day, because I like to focus on the average for the week rather than just. I know that some people are like, well, I can only weigh myself one day of the week, and so that's a whole other topic to get into. But seeing how your weight is changing over time is really big, because you might have seen a spike in weight in the middle of the week, but eventually it came back down. And so trying to think about what factors affect your weight, but also that's a really good way to see how you're progressing. But like Marissa was saying, the body composition and like how you look in pictures is, I almost think sometimes speaks even more than your weight can. And I see this for a lot of clients who just start off with me. They're like, well, I feel like I should be losing more weight. I feel like I'm not progressing. And I put their side by sides and I'm like, you are progressing. You're making a lot of changes. Your weight may be stable, but look at the changes. And they're like, oh my gosh, I didn't even realize. So taking progress pictures is a really good way to see how you're progressing over time. So try not to focus 100% only on weight.
Yeah. And I mean, it's really easy to just get frustrated if something's not changing on the scale. But like you said, muscle is more dense. So if you are building muscle, you're intentionally training, eating enough protein to do so, and putting your body in an environment where it can build muscle, that's going to slow down the rate at which you would see the scale go down because fat loss is happening, but muscle gain is also happening. And those things can offset each other to an extent. And I think, when we're looking at, okay, well, how is your weight actually changing? So like we will use weight as a metric to measure progress over time. So if you have hit that plateau for, 2, 3 weeks of full adherence and you've hashed out every detail and you've dotted your I's and you've crossed your T's on everything, then, okay, what kind of a change do we make? Typically, I don't do more than 20 or 30 carbs, and I don't do more than 10 fat usually. If I have to make a change, sometimes I'll do a little bit of both. So maybe 15 carbs, 5 fat. Um, Sometimes I think that decreasing by something as little as 10 carbs or like 2 or 3 grams of fat is just so little that it's really negligible. So if you're looking at this from like a calorie standpoint, 30 grams of carbs is going to be 120 calories. 10 grams of fat is close to 100 calories, about 90. So, we're making about 150 calorie change, probably to see a bigger deficit on a day-to-day basis, is typically the rule of thumb I'll go by.
Right. And you can change just carbs, you can change just fat, you can do a combination of the two to still hit that, if you wanted to do maybe 100, 120, 150 calorie difference. And what I typically do is I like to be, again, it's very individual based on the client, what they like to eat, what they struggle with, depending on what their numbers are at now. So take that into consideration. If you love your carbs but your fat is already pretty low, well, you might have to cut your carbs if you want to make a little bit of progress, but you want to, again, make sure that what you're doing, you're still liking your diet and you can be adherent to it.
Yeah. And I think one final note on how to manage your progress is to acknowledge here that coaching and what we do is literally a game of trial and error. And I don't think a lot of people realize that. I think they think we have the answers, we have the magic, but in all reality, it's a matter of managing variables, trial and error. And if something doesn't work, we make a change, we manage the rest of the variables, and we see if that pans out. If it doesn't, we analyze again, change a variable, keep the others constant, analyze that. And it's literally just that. So if you're going to do this for yourself, you have to realize it's no different than coaching. A coach is going to give you the objective view, the outsider's perspective, and maybe be a little bit more cutthroat when you need them to be. But at the end of the day, it's trial and error, it's consistency, it's patience, and it's making sure to look at every aspect of the picture.
Yeah. And I think just again, to briefly build off of that, like Marissa was saying, that some things are trial and error. And I mean, I know that with my clients, I'll be like, hey, let's try this. Let's just see what happens. Let's see how you respond. And it's nice to have someone else who's looking at your data a little bit more objectively and can give you some things to implement or some changes to try, and trying to have an open mind to things. So if you are like, well, this never worked in the past, or nothing works for me, or this is the only thing that I've ever done to see progress, just trying to be open to changes. And even if you are trying to do things by yourself, maybe trying something to implement, changing your ratios a little bit and seeing what happens. So it was a little bit of an experiment, so to speak.
Oh yeah. And I had a conversation with a client literally yesterday. Makes me think of this. When we had our consultation call, so I set her up with her program yesterday. We had our consultation call about 2 weeks ago, and she was complaining about how she's never been able to see progression in the gym. She's never gotten any stronger. She's used the same weight on the bar for a squat or a bench for years. She's never been able to see progress. And she was very frustrated by this. And then she sent her information in. And a lot of times there's this cognitive dissonance of like, you recognize that one thing is happening and you recognize that another thing is happening, but you don't really put them together. And she went over her macros that she had done for data collection. She was like, I just don't really think I'm eating enough. And, I just think, I probably could be eating more, but also like I get really nervous about going over a certain amount of carbs and going over a certain amount of fat. I get really nervous about that. And I told her straight up, I was like, look, the reason why you haven't made progress in the gym is because of this lack of willing to eat more than what you have in the past. And this is going to be the threshold at which you cross for seeing progress, the progress that you never made. But it's going to mean that you have to get uncomfortable. And that's what a coach will do for you, right? Is will push you to be uncomfortable, whereas we might not do that for ourselves because of our fears and our preconceived notions. So that was a conversation we had, just kind of putting two and two together of like, oh, okay, so I wasn't eating more than this. I was scared too. I was eating less. I know I was eating not enough. And also, I wasn't seeing progress in the gym, but those two things are so interrelated. So that might help someone else out who's listening to this as well.
Yeah, so we're over our hour limit that we try to set for ourselves. So the next topic we were going to talk about was meal timing principles. So I think we've already kind of covered this a little bit. And same thing with pre and post workout meals. So again, pre and post workout typically want to have a higher percentage of your carbs, moderate protein, lower fat. So pre and post typically are about the same. So when you are not close to your training time, you want to have probably a little bit higher fat, like moderate fat, higher protein meals, a little bit of lower carbs, because again, we're trying to utilize those carbs for your energy for your workouts.
Yeah, just to give you a little reasoning of why. So that pre and post workout meal, other than just, the carbs are the fuel and we need to digest those pre and post training to fuel training and fuel recovery. Why do we keep fat low? Why do we keep protein moderate? So we want to just keep this in the context of like your whole day. If you are having a bunch of carbs, my general rule of thumb is 20 to 25% of your total daily intake around in that pre-workout meal and that post-workout meal. So you're getting 40 to 50% of your day's worth of carbs in that peri-workout window. If you're eating that many calories of carbs, do you really think that adding more fat to that as well is going to digest well? That's just a huge meal. So keeping that context in mind, and then so if your carbs are really high at those two meals, then what are your other meals going to look like? They're probably going to be a little bit lower in carbs, but how do we balance that out? We use the fats that we weren't using at those pre and post workout meals. I think ties that all together of like why we're actually doing this, in addition to a higher fat intake can also slow digestion. So that's a good thing when we're not training because it helps keep us full, but it's not a good thing when we're training and we want to not puke because we're way too full and we haven't digested our food quite yet. So those are the reasons why we do this. And then the last thing I'll say on meal timing is what we said earlier of take your food intake, your protein intake, divide that by the number of meals that you eat per day. Try to space that throughout the day. You can, of course, have a specific eating window if you want, But in general, spacing out your meals evenly across the day or across your eating window is going to be the best thing to continually stimulate progress, recovery, and just overall a good balanced approach to meal portions and nutrition.
Yeah, I don't think I have anything else to add to that.
Cool. So yeah, we don't have much else, but we just kind of wanted to talk about the mindset about flexible dieting and tracking macros, like who it's for, who it's not for, where it can go wrong, and how do we like really make the most of this, I think. So I think talking about who it's for, who it's not for. I mean, obviously, if you're listening to this and you're towards the end of the episode here, it's probably for you to try if you've never tried before. It is a great way to develop a full comprehensive knowledge of nutrition, what goes into your body, what your body responds well to. I recommend that everyone tries it at some point if their goal is body composition change, but it can easily be taken too far. I think if you tend to get very obsessive over things in a way that brings you anxiety and is unhealthy for you, that is something to be aware of and to keep maybe just one foot out the door when you are doing this. If you know your personality is like that and it's something that affects your mental health negatively, just allowing yourself to engage in it fully enough to actually understand everything, know you're doing everything to the extent you need to see progress. But if it ever starts getting too far, knowing that you might need to pull back, maybe instead of using a food scale for everything, maybe practicing eyeballing things so that you can be comfortable with that. And just making sure that you can mentally balance the stressors of managing your diet, because ultimately adding this task to your life is a stressor. It can be a large one or a small one. As coaches, we try to make sure that it's a pretty small one, but depending on how you take it and your personality, that can go one way or the other.
Yeah. So the thing that I had mentioned previously is that when you start tracking, you just start to build this useless bank of information on food labels. And not useless, but I just think it's funny when you talk to someone else who like doesn't track macros at all. And then you're like, oh, the food label is this grams and this many ounces and there's this many servings. And they're like, how do you know that? But again, like we say, we recommend that you track macros at some point in your life, not to do for the rest of your life, but it just helps you get such a good idea of what you need to eat in order to reach your goals. So before I ever started tracking macros, I thought I was eating enough protein. And why did I think that? Well, because I thought I was eating protein. And so what you can't change what you can't measure. That's kind of my philosophy. So how, if I want to eat more protein, well, how do I know how much I'm currently eating? So that's why we recommend tracking macros. So if you want to lose weight and you know that you're eating 2,000 calories, well, then you can bring it down to 1,900. And then if you stall, you can bring it down to 1,800. So I like seeing the numbers. I like that data. It's really helpful for me. And again, if you want to change things, you can be very specific and you'd be very accurate. So what I like to do and what I like to tell my clients if we're transitioning off of tracking macros, because yes, it can be exhausting if you're doing it day in, day out, and you're being extremely accurate. So I will keep a mental note or like a mental list in my head. And sometimes we'll plug things in at the end of the day and just kind of see where I'm at and how I did without really thinking of anything. So for an example, might be like, okay, well, I went out to lunch and I had a salmon salad. So I know that I had quite a bit of fat. I hit my protein for that meal, but I was really lacking on carbs. So maybe I'll be like, okay, well, maybe let's say I'm taking a rest day. So I'm not having to worry about what I'm eating to fuel my body for a training session. But I might say, okay, well, I know for dinner, I can probably have something a little bit higher in carbs, but I need to have something that's moderate or low in fat. So just like small things like that throughout the day you can say, okay, I probably have like this much remaining, and you might be off like here and there, but you have a very good idea of what you should or shouldn't be eating.
Yeah, and that's the sustainable structure, right? Like that's exactly what I talked about at the beginning is this gives you the knowledge and the framework of like what you know now in every context. So it's not what tracking macros is not is I must have food scale and food app at all times. Otherwise, I am a failure and I must do nothing to manage my nutrition. It's taking the principles and taking the knowledge from that so that you can have a sustainable structure to your eating. So you know if I eat a donut, then I have to probably dial some things back with my other meals and not just eat them as normal. Otherwise, I'm probably going to be pushing myself over the edge here. And that you can't change what you can't measure is so pertinent. Oh my God. It's like the example of the guy who can't gain weight, who's like in college or high school. He's like, I can't gain weight. Like, okay, well,
My husband.
what are you eating? And, I eat a lot. Are you sure? Yeah, I eat a ton. There's no way I'm not in a surplus. Okay, well, can you quantify that for me? No, that's too much work. Well,
Well,
okay.
then what do you expect?
Like, what do you want out of that, right? So,
Right.
I think the mindset about it and what we take from it, I think what we do for our clients is we're really, really focused on, okay, yes, we're tracking macros, and maybe for a short term, we have a more unsustainable approach to it where we are weighing everything, we are plugging everything in. But over time, and we'll get into how to actually taper off of tracking macros and how to make that fully sustainable for yourself if that's your goal in the future. But, we take that information and then we apply it to contexts where maybe we are out and about for the day and we can't track our macros because we don't have our food scale or our phone's dead. And how do we implement those principles and those like rules and the knowledge that we have in the encyclopedia of all the nutrition information in our head on a day-to-day basis without having to plug it in? And so it's about building up the database. It's about building up your knowledge and your empowerment to know, what am I supposed to be having for my body at this time for this context, because I now have the tools and the knowledge to do so. So hopefully this was a good comprehensive discussion for you to understand how to get started with this, how to track everything, how to figure out how to actually make changes, and how to analyze progress a little bit. And we'll get into more on this. I think this, like, as always, like gives us more ideas for more episodes, but gives you a nice basic understanding of macros and how to work with them.
Yeah. And of course, if you have any questions, you can always reach out to me and Marissa, and we can try to explain things more in depth or maybe add things into a future podcast. But we're here to help you guys, and tracking macros can feel very overwhelming. There's a lot of work that goes into it initially, but eventually you learn a lot more, you feel more comfortable with what you're doing, and it just becomes kind of second nature, and you don't really have to think about it too much. So if it does feel overwhelming, just know that with time, with practice, that you'll get better at it, just like anything. And you'll be able to do things a lot easier than before.
Oh yeah, that reminded me the last thing I was going to say. If you feel overwhelmed by all of this, or when you first start plugging things in, that is normal. That everyone feels that way when they start. It does get easier. I always tell my clients the first couple of weeks are the hardest, the most intensive, takes the most effort, but over time it does become second nature, like you said.
Yeah. So I guess my last kind of takeaway, and this is what I tell clients as well, is it can be really difficult to kind of try to eat things throughout the day. And then you're like, oh no, I'm over on carbs. Oh no, I'm over on fat. So maybe take some time the night before or maybe the morning of and plan your meals throughout the day. And I think that's what helped me the most, was playing around with my Fitness Pal and being like, oh, okay, I can't have salmon and steak and egg yolks in the same day because then I blow through my fat too quickly. So there were some things I had to change, like switching to, egg whites, or maybe only, instead of having 2 eggs, full eggs, I'd only have 1. So just small things like that, but really sitting down and playing around with my Fitness Pal and understanding what foods you can eat are really, really helpful.
Yeah, that pre-planning. Like if you're going to say, I'm going to track macros, I'm going to hit these numbers, but I'm just going to go about my day and then plug it in at the end. you're not going to be successful. So it does take a certain amount of planning and preparation and learning how to manipulate things on a day-to-day basis in the app so that you know what your structure should look like for the day. I have a YouTube video on how to pre-plan your day, and I'll have we'll link it in the show notes for sure.
Yeah. So I think this was a really, really good episode, and we hope you guys enjoyed it and really learned a lot. If you haven't already, please make sure you're subscribed to the podcast, and you can find both of us on Instagram. You can find me at Christy Lynn Fit, and Marissa is at Marissa Roy Fitness. So thank you guys so much for listening, and we hope to see you back next week.